Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Sharri. Let's take a look at tonight's top stories. Former Prime Minister Scott Morrison will be on the show to discuss the lack of leadership the Albanese government is showing around the explosion in anti-Semitism. The High Court's controversial immigration ruling has led to the release of a murderer, a child abuser, and now a sex predator of elderly women on our streets. Paul Murray and Liz Storer will join me to break down the government's response later. And Shadow Communications Minister David Coleman will give us the details on what exactly the government can salvage from its much criticised misinformation bill. That's coming up a bit later in the show. But first tonight, we saw the ABC last night give its high-profile Q&A platform to an anti-Semite. The head of the Australian Palestine Advocacy Network, Nasser Mashni, a clear anti-Semite, was put on equal footing with an eminent Jewish lawyer, our former ambassador to Israel, and a government minister. Mashni was given the airspace on the public broadcaster to justify Hamas's actions, to say that the terror attacks came after years of suffering, and to repeat libels against Jews. Why is the public broadcaster giving airtime to an anti-Semite who has sprouted hateful views against the Jewish people? Airtime to someone who is unable to unequivocally condemn Hamas and the terror attacks that took place on October 7, the cruel slaughter of the old and the young alike. It's utterly unacceptable. Here's 5 examples of Nasser Mashni's blatant anti-Semitism that the ABC should have known about before giving him the Q&A platform last night. Firstly, at a rally in Melbourne in May 2018, Nasser Mashni called some Jews filth and said that only the Jewish attendees who were anti-Israel were real Jews.
In particular, we'd also like to thank members of the Jewish community for standing here with us today. Thank you. Because these are real Jews, not the filth we've got over there.
Not the filth we've got over there? He also sent a tweet where he called Zionists, Jews who support Israel, filthy. He wrote, and I quote, "If you had an ounce of humanity or self-respect, you'd realise that being called a Zio is the most derogatory insult imaginable. But then again, filthy Zios like you have no self-respect." Filthy Zios. The racist imagery of Jews as dirty vermin is an infamous feature of Nazi propaganda. Then, in another example, more recently, Nasser Mashni was furious that the Albanese government had condemned Palestinian violence against Jews.
I've never felt so alone when our Prime Minister condemned Palestinian violence from the river to the sea.
And that's just in the wake of the October 7 terror attacks. Someone who was angry at the Albanese government for condemning terror attacks against Jews. Those comments clearly anti-Semitic. He also called for the destruction of Israel on his radio show. And in clearly anti-Semitic remarks, he said the world's power structures, and I quote, all focus upon Zionism, another anti-Semitic trope. And in a 5th example, in January last year, Nasser Mashni called 6 Palestinian terrorists heroes. He wrote, "This picture represents the 6 Palestinian heroes who, using spoons, tunneled their way out of a Zionist, inescapable hellhole. Wishing everyone a happy, healthy and love-filled 2022. Everyone, that is, except for Zionists." Well, those so-called heroes he spoke about were actually terrorists. One of them, Mohammed Qassam, was involved in a suicide bombing operation that led to the deaths of 3 Israelis. Another, Eham Kamanji, kidnapped and murdered an Israeli civilian. A third, Yaqub Mahmoud Kadri, killed an Israeli civilian in a shooting attack. A 4th, Zakaria al-Zubaydi, planned a suicide bombing, and yet another, Mahmoud Abdullah Ada, was in prison for murdering Israeli police officer and trying to kill his wife. 5 of the 6 are members of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a terror group that has joined Hamas in the attacks on Israel. But to Mashni, they weren't terrorists, they were heroes. Despite all of this, 5 clear, known examples of anti-Semitism that were in the public domain, Nasser Mashni was still invited onto Q&A. The ABC happy to offer up its high-profile platform to someone who celebrates terrorism and who calls Jews filth. And last night in Q&A, when Mashni was asked to condemn Hamas, which just slaughtered Jews in the most barbaric fashion we've witnessed in recent history, he couldn't quite get the words out. He also couldn't clearly call for the release of innocent Jewish hostages.
Do you think Hamas is a terror organisation?
You cannot bring yourself to condemn Hamas.
Patricia, if you went back to my interviews after 16, I've done interviews where I have condemned
so
Hamas.
Because you don't want to be, I just want to get some clarity here, because you don't want to be on what you call the merry-go-round, you won't do it. I can't accept a narrative where I'm getting lectured by a lawyer on what is acceptable discourse. Isn't it just
what is
standard that anyone would condemn an attack on civilians?
I condemn the attack. I condemn an attack on any civilian, whether the death is by a masked gunman or an Air Force pilot dropping a bomb.
But that's not the question. It's about the Hamas gunman. By having to raise other things, what it does is you make it generalised when a specific question is asked.
Patricia, the challenge as Palestinians is that it doesn't matter how much we condemn, what we've condemned and who we condemn, we still get demonised, dehumanised, smeared for our own deaths.
Mashni couldn't bring himself to call Hamas a terrorist group and avoided answering the question by claiming he was Australian. I mean, it's just nonsense. How can the ABC have this person on again and again? How can they platform an anti-Semite? It was also wrong of the ABC to have Nasser Mashni on to speak about hostages when he himself has been convicted of false imprisonment. The Herald Sun reported that Mashni, and I quote, is a criminal with convictions for kidnap, violence and threatening behaviour. A criminal with convictions for kidnap, violence and threatening behaviour. Mashni was 22 years old when he chased a 15-year-old child who'd stolen 2 packets of cigarettes from the milk bar where he was working. Mashni beat him with a wooden axe handle, shoved him into the boot of his car, drove him to an abandoned paddock where he threatened to break his legs. And the Herald Sun reports that Mashni received 23 months in prison, suspended after pleading guilty to false imprisonment, intentionally or recklessly causing injury, and 1 count of threatening to inflict serious injury in June 1992. His sentence was wholly suspended on appeal in August that year. This is quite shocking. Mashni now says he's ashamed of his younger self and the pain he caused to the boy and his family. And you would have heard those comments if you were watching Q&A last night. And by the way, it's not just the ABC that gives Mashni a platform. He's a member of the prestigious YPO organisation for CEOs and managing directors. But last night, the ABC also gave ample airtime to UN Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, who provocatively said she couldn't tell the difference between Israeli and Hamas leaders.
When I hear Hamas leaders speaking and I hear Israeli military and political leaders speaking these days, I do not hear much difference. The level of dehumanization of the other, because there is a genocidal call that, I mean, Palestinians have been dehumanized through and through. They have been called animals. They've been, it was said that it's on record, it was said that no civilians are in Gaza.
Now, for you and I, we know what Hamas has done. We know how Israel was dragged into this war, how Israel goes above and beyond to protect civilian lives, whereas Hamas gleefully and in the most barbaric fashion murdered Jews on October 7. They didn't spare even the most vulnerable. I mean, you and I know this, but for the average ABC viewer who's consuming ABC News from morning to night, they may think that what the UN rapporteur says is accurate, that there's no difference between Israel and Hamas. And then again today, Albanese was given airtime at the National Press Club, and she kept repeating the line, Jewish-Israeli domination, which is clearly anti-Semitic.
I couldn't help but being tripped up by the very ending of your speech where you said that ending Jewish-Israeli domination would be rehumanising acts for them as well. I just want to ask whether that sort of comment is helpful in the current climate, talking about ending Jewish-Israeli domination.
I wonder whether it's helpful to pretend that apartheid doesn't exist, because this is what we are talking about.
The phrase jumped out at me at the end of your speech, and I'm just wondering if the trope of domination
No, it's not a trope, it's really real. So it seems not to understand what I'm saying. There is an apartheid regime. No, I'm serious. There is an apartheid regime. It's domination. This is not a trope. This is international law.
That journalist is from The Guardian, Australia. Even he knew that trope of domination is anti-Semitic. It is disgusting that she was given that platform to express anti-Semitic views. And the atmosphere in the room demonstrated how one-sided the Canberra bubble is. As you heard there, frequent applause, many questions focused on not anti-Semitism, Islamophobia.
What do you think are the main principles that have been lacking in the coverage so far? What role do you feel Islamophobia has played in the coverage and, I suppose, in the wider global response?
The Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, has described Hamas as a craven terrorist organisation that does embed itself in civilian infrastructure. But at the same time, she has said that Israel has an obligation to observe the rules of war. Is this an appropriate response, or is this an example of what you've described as the paralysis of the international community?
Human rights advocates have for years accused Israel of committing war crimes and violating international law with impunity. Many people are watching the death and destruction that's taking place in Gaza at the moment and are questioning whether there will ever be justice or accountability for the alleged crimes being committed. How can the paralysis that you spoke of earlier be ended?
It's unbelievable that these are the journalists in the nation's capital who bring the news to Australians. It's devastating. Sky News' Tom Connell was one of the few journalists who asked a challenging question, and he was mocked and even heckled. But giving Nasser Mashni and Francesca Albanese a platform is highly irresponsible by the ABC and by the National Press Club today. It directly risks inflaming anti-Semitism. It directly risks making life more unsafe for Jews. And can you imagine the media outrage if Sky News gave a platform to someone who had said similar racist things, that people are filth, about another minority group? But the ABC platforms this anti-Semite, Nasser Mashni, and no one blinks. And Labor politicians happily meet with him. Foreign Minister Penny Wong appears not to care about all the disgusting things that Nasser Mashni has said about the Jewish people. She met with him just recently in the wake of the terror attacks. Would Penny Wong meet with a neo-Nazi or a white supremacist? This man has called Jews filth and attacked the Albanese government for condemning violence against Jews. Why would she meet with him? I'm going to quote Claire Lehman from her brilliant column in The Australian once again yesterday. If a coalition minister posed in a photograph with a neo-Nazi who had called for Jews to be murdered on a radio show, the Australian media and public would rightly be apoplectic. But Australia's foreign minister can pose with a left-wing equivalent, and it barely raises a yawn. Now, this ultimately is the challenge for Labor. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese told everyone he was now a centrist, that he was ready to be Prime Minister and had left his radical past behind him. But as left-leaning commentator Joe Hildebrand explained on this program last night, being anti-Israel is one of the left's peak causes.
Among the inner city, frankly, very white, upper middle class left, being anti-Israel and pro-Palestine is almost a default position. It is almost hardwired. It's almost like it's just the cause du jour, if you like. We saw it, for example, in Marrickville, Anthony Albanese's, which is within Anthony Albanese's electorate.
And Joe himself is very strongly supportive of Israel, just clarifying that there. But now we're seeing former Labor leader in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, who lost his job amid an anti-Semitism crisis. Well, he's also unable to call out Hamas like Nasser Mashni. 15 times Piers Morgan asked him whether Hamas was a terror group, and Jeremy Corbyn wouldn't answer.
I do not approve, support or welcome Hamas.
Are they a terror group?
Everybody knows what they are.
Are they a terror group?
Look, Piers,
can you say it?
Piers, can we have a discussion?
Can you say it?
Can we have a discussion?
Can you call them a terror group? Jeremy,
can we have a discussion?
Can you call them a terror group?
Is it possible to have a rational discussion
with you? Are you prepared to call Hamas a terror group?
Is it possible to have a rational discussion with you? Is it possible? Come on, answer that question.
You can't, can you?
You answer it.
No, it's my show. You answer my question. Well, are Hamas a terror group?
Listen,
Are they a terror group?
Piers, can I speak?
Answer the question.
Can I speak?
Are they a terror group?
Piers,
no.
If you let me speak,
are they a terror group?
If you'll let me speak, I'll say something.
Go on then.
A ceasefire means both sides.
You said that. Are they a terror group?
Listen, I said that because
are they a terror group?
Part of the process.
Are they a terror group?
Can we?
Why can't you say it?
Piers, can we go through what ought to be happening?
Just answer my question.
Why do you think
are Hamas a terror group
in the world are calling for a ceasefire?
Are Hamas a terror group?
Come on, answer that. Answer me.
No, it's not your show.
You've got so many opinions.
Why should I answer yours when you won't answer mine?
Why do you give?
Good on Piers Morgan, and you can watch that full interview at 11 o'clock on Sky News tonight. And by the way, Anthony Albanese and Jeremy Corbyn are friends. They posed for photographs back in 2019, then the year earlier in 2018, and again here, and a fourth picture here. To be clear, I'm not accusing Anthony Albanese of anti-Semitism. I'm saying that he comes from the radical left of the Labor Party, where, as Joe Hildebrand said clearly, there's an anti-Israel disposition. And Albanese himself has spoken against Israel right throughout his parliamentary career, including holding the microphone at this pro-Palestinian rally when he was young.
The response of Israel has been to meet children throwing rocks with helicopter gunships, with tanks and with missiles.
Now, this leaves us with a massive crisis where anti-Semitism is at unprecedented levels, emergency levels, and these political figures of the left, like Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong, in the most senior positions in the federal government as Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, they seem to be finding it difficult to reconcile their long-held views formed through their formative years in politics with the responsibility and leadership they need to show now in unequivocally shutting down anti-Semitism. This is where we're at now. And at the end of the day, when you're the Prime Minister of Australia, this is no longer student politics and fighting the Tories. This is the lives of Australians. It's not a trivial matter. Anti-Semitism is already at boiling point, and the government needs to show leadership, and the national broadcaster also needs to be held to account for its inflammatory and dangerous coverage that could cost us lives. All right, let's bring in now Sky News host and Daily Telegraph's National Affairs Editor, James Morrow. James, thanks so much for joining us today. Look, what did you make of not only Francesca Albanese and Nasser Mashni on Q&A last night, but again, that performance by Francesca Albanese at the Press Club today?
Well, look, I thought the performance at the Press Club, the bits I saw from it, were incredibly smug. I wasn't in the room there today. I was in Sydney. However, I would also be really curious to know who there was applauding her when she gave that really smug answer. And were any of the press corps, any of the press gallery in the number that were, giving her a round of applause for that? Because I think the whole point of her shtick, if you will, which we saw in Q&A last night, and again today at the press club, is this sort of unanswerable bullying smugness where she declares something to be the case and then doesn't brook anybody saying anything else and challenging her with alternative facts, or as I would call it, reality about Hamas, the nature of Hamas, the nature of Gaza, the nature that Gaza has not been occupied for more than 15 years, and so on and so forth on down the line.
James, I just want to ask you, just before we move off this topic to some of the other top stories around today, over in the UK, their Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who, by the way, I thought from what I could see from Australia has been doing a brilliant job, you know, trying to come out strongly in support of Israel and the Jewish community. She was sacked by Rishi Sunak after she accused police of being too lenient with pro-Palestinian protesters. I mean, to me, that would seem to be true. She's been replaced by David Cameron. James, what do you think of what's going on in the UK and whether it was fair that she was sacked?
I think it's incredibly depressing, Sharri. I was very glum to hear the news last night when it came across, you know, especially after seeing all of those rallies, all of those marches in the UK, after seeing what had happened to poppy sellers at Victoria Station who had been surrounded by Palestinian thugs, essentially, and then been ushered off by the police and not allowed to, you know, stand up for their country. Suella Braverman called it out, said the Met Police is biased. The Met Police is a biased organization. You know, we know that they're much more concerned about people misgendering people on Twitter than they are about knife crime and property crime in London. That's been known for ages. But the way they've reacted here has been disgraceful. And I think she's also opened up a very necessary and potentially painful, but still necessary debate about multiculturalism and integration, and some of the things that we've seen in some communities that indicate that people are actually what is, I think, the heart of this, which is not just anti-Semitic, but anti-Western.
It's kind of scary when you think about the number of major cities that you would now feel unsafe in as a Jewish person, and it looks like London is one of them. Now, let's have a look at this exclusive story from the Daily Telegraph today, where Anthony Albanese will have flown a distance greater than the Earth to the moon when he lands in the US this week. I think it'll be his 20th international trip in about 18 months. It's for the APEC Forum in San Francisco. The Adelaide Advertiser has put together a map of all the places he's been. Have a look at this. We'll show, yep, there you go. Still no Israel though, James Morrow. Do you think he is travelling too much? And it's not about whether each trip is worthy or not. I'm sure they're all worthy, but it's that there is a cost of living crisis in Australia, and it's this sense that he's not giving enough time and attention to local issues and what's going on here.
Yeah, well, I think if things were going better here at home, Sharri, then I think there'd be less criticism of him. And, you know, for the record, I've been pretty generous about saying I think any Prime Minister, any Foreign Minister, any Defence Minister of Australia, whatever their party, it's good for them to be out there on the world stage. So I don't really have a huge problem with that. That said, though, what you have pointed out, though, is that, you know, he's very keen to go and, you know, hit Ukraine and places like that. But Israel, well, not so much. You know, it's telling the choices he does make and the choices he doesn't make. And at the same time, again, as you say, we are experiencing a cost of living crisis. So if he's going to be out on the VIP jet, jetting around the world, well, then he has a special obligation to ensure that he's in touch with people here at home. And I'll tell you what, that's not happening. And if you look at the latest Roy Morgan figures that have just dropped a little while ago, he's on a 50-50 two-party preferred now.
Yeah. All right, James Murray, thank you so much for your time. We'll see you on Sky News on Friday night. Now, coming up, I'm going to be joined by Paul Murray and Liz Storer. After the break, we're going to have a look at that immigration scandal that was the subject of Question Time today. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, we've already heard that among the dozens of immigration detainees released since the High Court's decision are hardcore criminals. Today, we learned some more information about one of them, Aliyawa Yaatwari, a refugee convicted of bashing a lone elderly woman and attacking two others in their home. When he was convicted, a district court judge said it was clear he posed an ongoing risk to women. He said, and I quote, "This is now the third offence involving a lone elderly woman with sexual overtones to it. The offender is making himself a danger to the Australian community." But now, after this landmark High Court ruling that rendered indefinite immigration unlawful, he's now free. The opposition argues that the government is putting national security at risk by releasing these criminal detainees onto our streets.
The Albanese Labor government has, following a High Court decision, released 80 hardcore criminals into the community. This includes a pedophile who raped a 10-year-old boy, a hitman who murdered a pregnant woman and blew up her body with military-grade explosives, and a violent sex predator who attacks elderly women in their home. Will the minister confirm how many of these 80 individuals are convicted pedophiles, murderers or rapists?
And this topic formed the focus of Question Time today. The government responded by saying that they weren't the ones who'd made the decision that indefinite detention was unlawful.
The Commonwealth argued against the release of these people. That's right. Some of these people have committed disgusting crimes. There is one single focus and one single priority that we are using to manage the implications of the High Court's decision, and that is the community safety of the Australian citizens who elect us to this parliament. Yeah. We are not going to get a lecture on managing the integrity of the migration system by the Leader of the Opposition.
Order.
All right, and let's bring in now Sky News hosts Paul Murray and Liz Storer. Welcome.
I take Dutton over her all day, every day, twice on Sundays.
Well, not to go straight back to Israel, but yesterday, nothing about the weekend protests and what happened outside Caulfield. She was quick to tweet about Donald Trump Jr., as you said, but nothing about similar figures in those terrorist preachers in recent weeks.
Home Affairs is for the toughest of souls, the strongest of hearts, because there are plenty of people who will game the system, play the system and use all of the emotion of the system. This government's already made the ludicrous decision that most of the 50,000 people who arrived here illegally by boat, the last time they were around, they end up becoming permanent citizens. Message sent back through the system, look, it'll be uncomfortable, but wait it out. The decision of the High Court sends exactly the same message. The Immigration Minister stands up today and says, yes, they're all on welfare. And what is inexplicable about this situation is the court is independent, can make its ruling, but the government knew the case was before it. She said it herself. They were arguing the case, which means you have to prepare yourself for if you lose it.
Yeah.
What's the plan? Is it going to be some sort of way of being able to constantly monitor, to force these people with these records to have to turn up to a police station once a week? What about putting a tag on some of these people?
But that costs the taxpayer so much money.
Correct.
And we're talking about 93 more detainees on top of the 80 we've just seen released. And when you consider that some of these offences include murder, these aren't just petty traffic fines or what have you, although those are also in the lineup of offences. I don't think we so much care about those. But when you are talking about murderers now being let back out into the community, and here we have our government literally just baying at each other during question and answer time today, instead of actually going, why don't you just push through new legislation? Correct. Why don't you treat this like the emergency that it is, and you uphold your responsibility to the Australian people to keep them safe, because you've obviously failed them once by letting them out into the community in the first place. They've offended. Now you're being told you're not allowed to keep them locked up. Stop talking like you aren't the lawmakers and therefore responsible for the fact that this has happened, and it will continue to happen if you don't act very quickly and decisively.
Because it's this thing, sorry, I was going to say, federal government can't control the outcome of the court.
Of the High Court.
So, it's mischievous to pretend that under the Albanese government, right. But what they can control is the response. And the response, of course, was that this decision was made last week. And effectively, the government has done nothing since. It has waited until now, what, the second day of the beginning of the end of question time. We're being told that legislation to potentially deal with this doesn't come anywhere near the parliament till next year. Not acceptable, not okay. But what are you surprised? This, as Sharri says, is from the very same minister who can't dare talk about a hate preacher, not dare say that she would use ASIO, the AFP, anything like that to go after the people who are so brazen that they are recording what they are saying and putting it out on the internet. There is something weird at the heart of the people running Home Affairs right now, and if they think touchy-feely is the way to protect the country will respond.
Well, it's not just Home Affairs, Paul, it's the entire government. They seem to forget that actually they are in government now. Actually, you are the Prime Minister now, you are the Foreign Minister, you are the Home Affairs Minister, and it is up to you to protect Australians, all Australians, not just your voters in marginal Western Sydney seats, but people who might not vote for you, who might live in teal seats or Liberal seats, the Jewish community. It is your job to protect all Australians, not just some. And this is what they seem to be forgetting. In respect of this immigration, like you said, Liz, why haven't they explored, in advance of the High Court decision being handed down, whether to put ankle bracelets that can track people, whether to have them check in at local police stations, rush through emergency legislation, but it shouldn't even need to be emergency legislation because they've been in government for over a year and a half now. They knew this was coming.
Yep. And what are you doing all day in that place if it's not to make the laws and close the loopholes to ensure things like this never, ever happen? And to your point about these MPs who clearly seem to be shilling for votes and know that there is perhaps more Muslim votes in their particular constituency than there is Jewish votes in their particular constituency, something that they need to remember is there is a heck of a lot of Gentiles who have beef in this fight too, because we are watching what is occurring and we too vote. So if they're genuinely playing that game based on what is the demographic of the people who vote in my seat, don't be weighing up those numbers because they're lying to you. We are watching and we vote too.
Yeah, I mean, also, legal immigration versus legal immigration, be it in any community of faith, Australians they've made this very clear, right? If you want to say that over the past couple of elections, Australians made it very clear about climate change, you know what they made very clear for about 20 years? The delineation between legal and illegal immigration, all right? And how illegal immigration needs to be dealt with. But just remember, just think back to the form of this government about when they are faced with a decision to be hard-hearted or otherwise the ISIS brides. Remember the ISIS brides that, of course, Peter Dutton said no, put the application bottom of the field, bottom of the field, bottom of the field. What happened? They came straight back. Now, did these people go on to commit terror attacks? No, but the whole point was...
Touch wood.
Of course. But the whole point is that that's the message that gets sent. If you send any other message then, unless you come through the front door, unless you take care of the country that you live in, then we're going to find ways to keep you out of the joint. This government, multiple facets now, is finding ways to not do that.
But what's frightening is this is a trend among the West. In the UK, you just get across the channel, you're in. They're literally saying we can't take any more. UK taxpayers are forking out millions of pounds per day to put these people up. In America, we're seeing the same. The southern border is just an absolute free-for-all. The Biden administration's doing absolutely nothing to stop it. These sanctuary cities are becoming absolute slums right under the nose of Americans. And here you see Australia seemingly going down that path, obviously to a much smaller degree. But one wonders if we didn't have the geographic advantage of being a giant island, I dare say that this government would be just as weak as the Biden administration has been in protecting their borders, because if this is how they treat the Crims...
Or if they didn't know it was electoral suicide.
Well, you've got to hope it still is. This is the thing. We keep being told how everything's changed, how everything's softened, everything's some grand left revolution that took place in May of last year. Well, the voice vote showed, no, there's still a beating heart of common sense for people to draw a line somewhere. You would hope that is still there in this scenario, because I tell you what, watching Question Time today, watching the arrogance of the government basically now trying to go into get Dutton on every single answer, every single time, and then on substantive issues they can't even answer Lee about things like cutting petrol tax. Watch this space. It's going to get very interesting.
Yeah, I think the most amazing thing is that, we thought the Albanese team took a small target strategy to the last election, and then all we've seen since then are the most vast, radical policies, whether it's misinformation or IR.
But that's the thing, get the power and then say we need to keep it because the other guy's too extreme.
Bring him back. Liz Storer will see you tonight on air, 9 and 10 o'clock.
Thank you, mate.
Sharri. After the break, Scott Morrison will join me to discuss his recent trip to Israel and whether the government is doing enough to stop the anti-Semitism crisis we're seeing. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back. I'm joined now by former Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Welcome to the program.
G'day, Sharri.
Now, just before we move on to Israel and your trip to Israel just recently, I want to ask you about this big story on immigration today. You're obviously a former immigration minister. What tools are available to the Albanese government in the wake of this High Court decision if it wanted to keep these 80-plus hardcore criminals off the streets?
Well, they should have been moving on legislation this week. They should have had a bill ready to go. And they would certainly, I'm sure, have a willing opposition to make sure that we could act with urgency. But it seems that we're going to be leaving here this week and the protections will still not be in place as they need to be. And that is, I think, quite reasonably concerning to everybody. I mean, I know how they got here in the first place. They came on boats that the Labor Party let in when they were in government under the Rudd years. And we're still dealing with that terrible legacy of those border protection failures all those years ago. And here we are still. So, they're in a unique position where in the opposition they will have a willing partner to be able to, toughen the laws where they need to be toughened to deal with the High Court decision. But they seem to be being caught very flat-footed, and that's disappointing given the gravity of what we're talking about here. We're talking about some pretty abhorrent criminals that are... being released into the community here. And I think the community has a pretty reasonable concern about this, and they would have expected more.
Look, I want to ask you about Israel now. Obviously, you've just returned from a trip to Israel this week. We've seen that first the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, said that Israel should take steps towards a ceasefire. The Prime Minister tried to walk back her comments, although not terribly convincingly. Why do you think, having just been there, do you think a ceasefire would be in Israel's best interests?
No, it would not. And it certainly would not. And what Hamas was seeking to do was use its information war and its information campaign to put pressure on Israel to do just that so they could regroup. And that would have been, even the UK opposition leader has acknowledged that. And he's certainly a much greater improvement on Jeremy Corbyn on these issues. There's no doubt about that. But that said, I think there is a common sense here that says that Hamas was seeking to apply that pressure to Israel. Israel rightly continued to pursue their very just defence. On the terrible atrocities that were committed against them on the 7th of October. And we must remember that this is how this started. This is why this has happened. What we're seeing in the Middle East now is the consequences of Hamas's atrocities inflicted on Israel. That is why this is happening.
The other comments that we keep hearing from both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister is this lecturing of Israel on proportionality, on its response, on, they keep lecturing Israel to abide by international law, the implication being that they're not abiding by international law, when in fact Israel takes every step possible, goes above and beyond, millions of text messages, leaflets, phone calls to try and keep civilians safe.
True.
Do you think the current government is sidestepping long held on both sides of politics bipartisan approach to Israel?
I have been concerned about the sort of apparent confusion about these things coming from the government. I mean, we had a resolution in the Parliament, and that was a good resolution. If it had, I think I would have had a stronger resolution, but nevertheless, it was a good resolution and I was pleased to support it. But there has been these statements and a tone, as you said, which suggests some type of equivalency here, and there's none. That was the point that Boris Johnson and I were making when we went to Israel. Any suggestion or implication left hanging out there that there's some sort of equivalency, moral equivalency, between the atrocities committed by Hamas on Israelis and what now Israel's doing in its self-defence. And as you said, Boris and I were both taken through in quite a bit of detail by none less than the President and the Prime Minister, what they're doing in those operations to provide warning, to provide those opportunities for humanitarian relief. I mean, we're dealing with an opponent here, an enemy here, that hides in hospitals and that fires rockets from hospitals. I mean, we're not dealing with an organisation here who plays by the rules. And the idea that Israel could leave Hamas in a position where they could strengthen their position, and for that matter to go unresolved into the future, is just simply unacceptable, because there would be no possibility of Israelis being able to live in that part of their country. And so, of course, they need to pursue this. Of course, they need and are providing the necessary warnings and humanitarian corridors and pauses that you expect. And I agree with you, Sharri. I think there's this tone which indicates that, we have to tell Israel to play by the rules. Well, who's saying they're not? And why is it being raised in such a way to imply that it's not? I mean, they are a great friend of Australia, and if you can't stand with Israel in its darkest hour over an atrocity, which was the single worst day for Israel and the Jewish people since the Holocaust, then when can you? I mean, it is extraordinary. And I think the sort of speaking out of both sides of the mouth on these issues has the appearance of that. And I hope it's only the appearance of that. But the mere appearance of it is really, I found, very concerning.
No, I completely agree with you, and thank you for those strong comments. Look, we've seen an explosion in anti-Semitism just on the weekend, those protests in the heart of Jewish suburbs, Caulfield and Coogee, which also has a lot of Jewish people, but it would have terrified non-Jews as well. Plus restaurants vandalised, graves desecrated. This is unlike the Australia that we know. We're not seeing the leadership from the Prime Minister to unequivocally call this out, to hold a press conference, say this has got to stop. What would you do, Mr Morrison, if you were Prime Minister and we've seen this epidemic of anti-Semitism?
Well, let's first of all say what is obvious, and this behaviour is shameful, and I've seen it not just here in all the places you've said, but also I saw it in the UK when I was there as well. And, it is intimidating and can be terrifying to Jews in Australia and elsewhere, and it needs to be called out as such, and it needs to be said very clearly from the outset that it's just not on. I mean, I think it's on the 27th of November. In Melbourne, they're organising a school walkout. I mean, they're organising for children not to go to school and participate in an anti-Israel protest, which I just find unthinkable in this country, that children would be employed in that way in this issue. And I would be thinking that the Education Minister federally and at a state level in Victoria should be using every power and every ounce of influence they have and persuasion to ensure that just doesn't take place. I mean, I think what Australians want to see here, who feel strongly about this, is just the instinctive response. And I think the instinctiveness in terms of Australia, the government's response, hasn't been what I think they expected. And so as a result, when you leave a space, when you create, when there's a vacuum, well, it'll get filled. And that's why I think it's important to strongly make it very clear about what's expected here. And but having said that, I'd give a shout out to Chris Minns in New South Wales. Chris and I went to Israel 20 years ago together. And I understand his strong views on this. Bill Shorten was with me on that visit that time 20 years ago as well. And so there are people in this parliament on both sides and in the state parliaments who know what the instinctive response should be. But I fear that Australians haven't seen it.
Scott Morrison, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Sharri.
Now, still to come, Labor seems to be progressing with its dangerous misinformation bill. I'll discuss this with David Coleman next. Welcome back. Well, Communications Minister Michelle Rowland says she's considering changes to the misinformation bill and planning an overhaul, but it appears the Albanese government is still pressing ahead with it. Let's bring in now Shadow Communications Minister David Coleman. David, welcome to the program. Does it surprise you that they haven't just dropped this altogether, given there were 23,000 responses to this legislation and most of them were highly critical?
Oh, Sharri, they should absolutely drop it. I mean, this thing is toxic. It was toxic on day one and it's toxic today. 23,000 people felt so strongly about it that they wanted to come out and express their concerns. And basically what we saw on Sunday was Michelle Rowland try to sort of slip out a little announcement to say, we're going to take some things out, we're going to improve the bill, but we're still going to progress on the bill. I think, to be frank, Sharri, they want us to just stop talking about it. They want this issue to die down a bit, but it's not going to die down, and we're going to keep talking about it because it's a shocking bill and it must not proceed.
The main concern with the bill, among many, is freedom of speech. Do you think her changes that she's announced on Sunday go far enough to address this?
No, not at all. I mean, the main thing she announced on Sunday, Sharri, was she's decided now that ACMA bureaucrats won't get to decide whether religious beliefs are misinformation or not. Believe it or not, in the original bill, or in the bill as we still have it, religious beliefs were captured. The government exempted comedians from the bill, but not Australians expressing profoundly held religious beliefs. And the minister, 4 months later, has worked out, might have not been such a great idea to do that. But that's about all she said on Sunday. I mean, the fundamental problem here is this is going to capture thousands of things that Australians say every day. They might be saying they're going to exempt statements about religious belief, but what about political belief? I mean, so many things that Australians believe in, that Australians say about politics could be captured by this bill, and that is not the sort of country that we live in, and it's absolutely wrong.
And this legislation would come on top of the tech giants regulation already, which is so restrictive and has deemed very important stories like the Hunter Biden laptop and the origin of COVID, and even criticism about mandates during the pandemic. All of those have been labelled misinformation. David, very quickly, one of the other problems about the legislation is that people could be fined $8,000 a day for every day they fail to turn up to ACMA to account for their misinformation. Do you think that the government will remove this?
They absolutely must do that, Sharri. I mean, they must throw the whole thing out. This is incredible. So if you are accused of a serious crime in Australia, you generally do not have to answer questions, the right to silence and so on. If you're accused of misinformation under this bill, there's no right to silence. You've got to show up where the government tells you to show up. And if you don't show up to answer those allegations of misinformation, you can be fined more than $9,000 per day. Now, what sort of government does that? That's in the bill.
No,
and it is just incredible, Sharri.
All right, David Coleman, thank you very much for your time. And thanks everyone at home for watching. I'll be back tomorrow at 5 o'clock. And here's Peter Credlin.